Your book mentions too that a lot of the poor people went to the big cities. Now I want to say this about the big cities. What are the 4 biggest cities in the world? I'm not sure I know anymore, but when I was a kid, the teachers told us the 4 biggest cities in terms of population are not necessarily in the right order, but London, New York, Berlin, and Tokyo. But today, what are the 4 biggest cities? Probably, from what I heard, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo. Anyone recognize some of those names? They're all Latin American cities. Again, I've heard that. Now, if any of you know any differently, you're welcome to intervene, but I've heard that population-wise, and I don't know which one's the biggest, but they're supposed to be the 4 biggest cities, and 3 of them are right on the Atlantic coast of South America. The other one, Mexico City, and I mean, I've been to Mexico City, and I will say this, it is huge. All right. Again, we could spend an entire semester talking about Latin America, but we must leave and go to the United States. The United States set up a constitution and swore in a president. Now, I hope all of you know who our first president was. George Washington. Maybe you don't. But George Washington was our country's first president. And they're lately saying that of all the country's presidents, he was the richest. Just 2 days ago, we celebrated President's Day. He probably, in terms of modern money, in terms of the land he held, was probably our richest president. Thomas Jefferson, back Alexander Hamilton was not a president. Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's financial advisor, Secretary of Treasury, and he got set up the banking system that some people say went on to make America really great, that we have a central bank. Now I say that tongue-in-cheek because the final chapter I've written, I have heard some people really criticize Hamilton severely because this central bank, while it's lasted more than 200 years, is slowly and gradually eroding away our economy, putting us deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, until one day we're going to find ourselves so deep in we can't get out. But anyway, at the moment, Hamilton is still honored, and you'll find Hamilton's picture on the back of a $10 bill. No, he was not a president, but he was a Secretary of Treasury. But anyway, Jefferson and Madison tried to decentralize and make the federal government less prominent and less intrusive. In the meantime, though, I mean, again, if you were taking American history, you would spend a whole chapter, pardon me, you'd spend 2 or 3 weeks talking about what they're talking about in 1/2 a page here on page 584. We're going to have to move along fast. The United States continued to grow. We took in more and more states. We expanded westward. Napoleon Bonaparte eventually sold Louisiana Purchase to us. And eventually we fought a war with Mexico and took their territory. Texas became independent, but then Texas joined the Union. Spain sold Florida, and we just kept adding more and more territory until we got all the way to the West Coast. In the meantime, a Chief Justice named John Marshall usurped the power of judicial review. He said that any law passed by Congress can be nullified by an act of the judges. And again, I have to say this, I'll have to pause here. I mean, I'm looking at the middle of page 584. Does it seem fair to you that the Supreme Court can rule on an issue 5-4, and that issue become the fixed law of the land, and their decisions cannot be overturned? The last time a Supreme Court decision was overturned by a constitutional amendment vote was in 1912, 102 years ago. It was income tax. Congress passed an income tax law. The Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. So the Congress and the states got together and passed a constitutional amendment granting income tax. That's been 102 years ago. They can make a decision 5-4, and it's the law of the land, and it can't be overturned. Practically not. Congress has had takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to pass an amendment. And some of their decisions have favored criminals, have made it more difficult for the police to operate. And the reason I'm not teaching in public schools today, folk, and the reason my 3 children have never been inside a public school, I blame a lot of the problems with public schools on Supreme Court decisions, which sound great philosophically, but are impractical. Decisions that make it difficult for teachers to enforce rules and make it difficult for principals to enforce rules and give the kids the upper hand in almost every clash. And the result is teachers cannot teach. If I'm wrong, tell me. I mean, I've had persons complain when I talk about the public schools, but other persons saying, to me, the American public schools are in such bad shape that they're beyond fixing. Anybody want to comment? I'll listen. If you haven't been in American public school, I mean, but they're beyond fixing. They're bad. Nothing we can do. We pour more. We pay our teachers more. We pour more money. American schools have the best lighting, the best heating, the best buses, the best climate control, the higher paid teachers in most other places, and they are sometimes called the nation's failing public schools. And I heard one talk show man say recently, any parent who would send his kid to a government, he called them government schools, send his kid to a government school is guilty of child abuse. The kids there fear for their own safety, fear of being bullied. Hey, folks, I mean, everybody seems to be listening. I mean, even though some of you who were asleep, something got away, which I mean, but if you want to comment, say something. I mean, at least I seem to have your attention. Speak up. If you want. I mean, if you don't like what I'm saying, hey, tell me right now. I won't argue. I'll just listen. I'll have my word. You can have yours if you want. I mean, some of you may never been inside an American public school. Again, I blame place a lot of the blame on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules our country like a dictator, and as long as they're in charge, we don't have an option. The Supreme Court makes all of our moral decisions for us, not our elected officials. They define our morality. They make laws and they can legislate, and their laws cannot be overturned. I've been around long enough to see many a law passed by Congress that was overturned by this later Congress. Judges seldom reverse their own decisions. 9. John Marshall was the justice who did it. Andrew Jackson helped make the country more democratic as more and more people got the right to vote. Now, originally, folks, the way our founding fathers set it up, only land-owning white males could vote. Now, I have to state it. It was only land-owning white males. Then it was the poor people, the poor men could not vote. Women could not vote. Women did not get the right to vote until about 1920. We'll talk more about that later. But eventually they expanded. They said, well, hey, some people are successful with their own property. So then they said, well, if you're a successful businessman, then they finally decided they couldn't decide who was successful and who was not, and they let anyone vote. Any white man, that is, vote. Pardon me. I have to tell it the way it was. I mean, it's not that I want to open up old racial wounds, but at the same time, I can't sweep under the rug. I mean, only white males could vote. Then eventually, gradually, slowly, laws were passed and extended the vote to former slaves, to blacks, and then eventually to women. And believe it or not, the last of all people to get the right to vote was the Native American Indian, whose rights were finally respected even after women had gotten their rights. Now, our country became increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. And particularly as we expanded into the new territories, mostly toward the west, the issue came up, should slavery be allowed in these new territories or not? And this was an issue, folk, that really was a tough one to decide. I mean, I've tried to put myself back in that time era and argue the issue. The problem was, particularly when gold was discovered in California, and there was a big gold rush. I mean, everybody rushed to California. And then, when they got there, they found there was no law. Well, President Taylor told the people of California, organize yourself for statehood, which means you have to draft a constitution. The problem was California was a southern state. I mean, if you look on a map, it was in the south, and therefore it should have been brought into the Union as a slave state. Except that 90% of the men who went there said, we don't want slavery here. So they wrote up an anti-slave constitution, which meant they called themselves a free state. And they simply said, we're not going to have a slave state here. And they finally, though, after working out a compromise, worked out a compromise where California was admitted to the Union in 1853. And again, they had to organize for statehood because they had so much crime. And without a governor, without a legislature, without judges, they could not punish the criminals, they could not build jails, they could not bring justice. So they worked hard to get this state organized, but they came in as a free state. Well, that was in 1850. The agitation